The audience never heard the opening note. For decades, people would remember the concert as the night Elvis Presley refused to sing. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was far stranger. It began the exact moment Elvis looked into the crowd and recognized a face that was never supposed to appear again. A face he had searched for over 3 decades. A face belonging to a man the entire world believed had never existed. Las Vegas. The year was 1975. The showroom glittered beneath oceans of golden light, every crystal chandelier reflecting thousands of tiny stars across the packed arena. Not a single seat was empty. Some people had driven across the country. Some had waited outside the theater since sunrise. Others had sold treasured family possessions for one chance to witness the greatest entertainer alive. Tonight wasn't just another concert. People whispered that Elvis looked healthier, happier, more energized than he had in years. Rumors spread through the crowd that he was preparing a surprise no audience had ever seen. Nobody realized destiny had already prepared a far greater surprise. Backstage, the orchestra tuned their instruments one final time. A violin released a soft, trembling note. Trumpets echoed briefly through the hallway. The drummer rolled his sticks across the snare with practiced confidence. Beyond the curtain, thousands of voices merged into one thunderous chant. Elvis! 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 The sound shook the building itself. One stagehand smiled nervously. They're louder than last night. Another laughed. They're louder than every night. Elvis stood alone near the curtain. He wore the famous white jumpsuit covered with sparkling stones that caught every beam of light. To the world, he looked fearless. But only one person noticed the tiny tremor in his hands. Charlie Hodge quietly stepped beside him. "You ready?" Elvis forced a smile. "I've been ready my whole life." The stage manager lifted 3 fingers. 3. The orchestra straightened. 2. The curtain mechanisms rumbled softly. 1. The lights exploded. The audience erupted with such force that the first notes of the orchestra nearly disappeared beneath the applause. Elvis stepped onto the stage. Every camera immediately found him. Every spotlight followed him. Thousands of people stood together. Some cried before he had spoken a single word. Elvis lifted one hand. The cheering grew even louder. He walked toward the microphone with effortless confidence. Exactly as he had done hundreds of times before, the conductor raised his baton. The opening chords filled the theater. Elvis reached for the microphone. His fingers wrapped around it. He took a slow breath. Then, he looked up. Not toward the front rows, not toward the cameras, not toward the balcony. His eyes drifted all the way to the very back of the arena. The smile disappeared from his face completely. His heartbeat stumbled. His breathing stopped. Everything around him became strangely distant. The music, the applause, the flashing cameras, they all faded into silence. Because standing in the last row, almost hidden beneath the shadows, was an elderly man wearing a faded brown coat. He wasn't applauding. He wasn't waving. He wasn't smiling. He simply stood there, watching Elvis with calm, unwavering eyes. The old man's face was deeply lined by time. His hands rested on the top of a worn wooden cane. His hat had seen countless winters. To everyone else, he looked like an ordinary stranger. To Elvis, he looked like a ghost. "No," The word escaped Elvis's lips so quietly that only the microphone captured it. Charlie Hodge frowned backstage. What did he say? Nobody answered. Elvis blinked once, twice. The old man was still there. Impossible. He couldn't be. Elvis had spent years trying to find him. Private investigators, newspaper advertisements, letters, phone calls, quiet conversations after concerts. Millions of dollars. Nothing. The man had vanished without leaving behind a single trace. Yet now, he stood less than 100 feet away, watching silently, as though he had known this moment would come. The orchestra continued playing. The audience waited for Elvis to begin singing. Instead, his grip weakened. The microphone slipped from his hand. It struck the stage with a sharp, metallic crack. The sound echoed through the theater like a gunshot. The orchestra stopped instantly. Every musician looked toward the conductor. The conductor looked at Elvis. Nobody moved. For a moment, the audience laughed nervously. Surely this was part of the performance. Someone even applauded. But Elvis never smiled. He never reached for the microphone. His eyes never left the old man. Backstage, Colonel Parker rushed toward the curtain. What is he doing? No one could answer. Elvis slowly stepped away from center stage. Security guards immediately moved toward him. He raised one hand. Don't. His voice was calm, firm. The guards froze. He walked down the stage stairs, one slow step at a time. The audience fell into stunned silence. People leaned into the aisles, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Television cameras abandoned the stage and followed Elvis through the crowd. Children stopped talking. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever was unfolding. Elvis continued walking, past celebrities, past politicians, past wealthy businessmen seated in the front rows. He ignored every familiar face. His destination had never changed. The old man waited exactly where he had been, not moving, not speaking, only watching. When Elvis finally stood before him, neither man said a word. The silence became almost unbearable. It felt as though the entire world had stopped breathing. Then, Elvis slowly lowered himself onto one knee. A wave of shocked gasps swept across the theater. One woman covered her mouth, another burst into tears without understanding why. Even the security guards stared in disbelief. Nobody had ever seen Elvis kneel before another person. Not for royalty, not for presidents, not for anyone. The old man's weathered eyes filled with quiet emotion. His trembling hand disappeared inside his old coat. Every camera zoomed in. The audience leaned forward. He slowly withdrew something no larger than the palm of his hand. A small, rusted key. Old, scarred, almost forgotten by time. It looked utterly worthless. Yet the instant Elvis saw it, his entire body shook. His eyes overflowed with tears. He reached toward the key with both hands, treating it as though it were the most precious object on earth. The old man gently placed it into his palms. Elvis closed his fingers around it. For several long seconds, he couldn't speak. Finally, he whispered only 4 words. You kept your promise." The old man smiled for the very first time. "I told you," he replied softly. "You would come back." The audience stared in complete confusion. Nobody understood what they had just heard. Elvis slowly stood and picked up another microphone from a nearby stagehand. His voice trembled. "Tonight," he paused, struggling to steady his breathing. "I cannot give you the concert you came to see." A murmur spread through the arena. "I owe someone a debt that applause could never repay." He looked down at the old key resting in his hand. "Before there were gold records, before there were sold-out arenas, before anyone called me a king, there was one night when I believed my life was over." His eyes met the old man's once again. "I have hidden what happened that night for more than 30 years. He swallowed hard. "I thought the secret would be buried with me." Another long silence filled the theater. Then Elvis raised the rusted key for everyone to see. "But this key opened far more than a door. It saved my life." No one in that arena realized it yet, but before the night was over, the world would discover that the greatest turning point in Elvis Presley's life had never happened beneath bright lights or roaring applause. It had happened alone, on a cold, forgotten night, when a frightened young dreamer met a mysterious stranger carrying nothing more than an old, rusted key. No one moved. More than 10,000 people sat in complete silence, their eyes fixed on the old, rusted key resting in Elvis's trembling hands. Not a single instrument played, not a single spotlight shifted. Even the photographers, who had spent their careers chasing unforgettable moments, lowered their cameras. Some moments were too sacred to interrupt. Elvis looked down at the key for a long time before finally speaking again. "I've spent more than 30 years trying to convince myself that this night never happened." His voice was barely above a whisper. "But every time I walked onto a stage, every standing ovation, every gold record, every television appearance, they all reminded me of one question." He slowly looked toward the elderly man. "Why did you disappear?" The old man didn't answer. Instead, he gave Elvis the smallest nod, as though silently granting him permission to continue. Elvis inhaled deeply. "When people tell my story, they always begin with success." A faint smile crossed his face. "They talk about the music, the crowds, the fame." The smile faded. "But they never tell you about the night I almost walked away forever." The enormous screen behind the stage slowly faded to black. The audience could almost feel themselves traveling backward through time. The year was 1945, long before fame, long before fortune, long before anyone outside his neighborhood knew the name Elvis Presley. Rain hammered the streets of Memphis with relentless force. The sidewalks shimmered beneath weak yellow streetlights. A skinny young man walked alone through the storm. His shoes were soaked. His jacket was torn at one shoulder. His stomach had been empty since the morning before. Every step felt heavier than the last. Inside the paper bag he carried were a few handwritten songs. Nothing else. No money, no promises, no future. That afternoon, another music producer had rejected him. He hadn't even listened to the second verse. "You're wasting your time, son." Those words refused to leave his mind. "You don't sound like anyone people want to hear." Another man had laughed. "Maybe find yourself a real job." Those voices echoed louder than the thunder. Young Elvis stopped beneath an old street lamp. Rain poured from his hair onto the folded pages inside the paper bag. One by one, he pulled the songs out. He stared at the words he had written with such hope. Then he slowly crumpled the first page. Another, then another. The wind carried the soaked paper into the empty street. For a long moment, he simply watched his dreams disappear into the rain. I guess they were right. His voice cracked. I'm never going to make it. He leaned against the cold brick wall of an abandoned warehouse. His shoulders shook. Not because of the cold, because for the first time in his life, he had stopped believing in himself. A distant train horn echoed through the night. He wiped his face and started walking again. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he couldn't bear another rejection. Several blocks later, he noticed a tiny diner still open despite the storm. Warm light spilled through the fogged windows. He stood outside for nearly a minute. The smell of fresh bread drifted into the street. His stomach growled painfully. He reached into his pocket. 1 coin. Not enough. He quietly turned away. "Young man!" The voice came from behind him. Elvis froze. An elderly stranger stood beneath the awning, holding an umbrella that had clearly survived many years. His brown coat was old, his boots were worn, his eyes were kind. "You look hungry." Elvis forced a smile. "I'll be all right." The stranger shook his head. "No one says they'll be all right the way you just did." Before Elvis could refuse again, the man opened the diner's door.
"Come inside. I don't have enough money." "I wasn't asking for your money." The warmth inside the diner wrapped around Elvis like a blanket. A waitress quietly placed a bowl of hot soup on the table. Fresh bread followed, then coffee. Elvis stared at the food. "I can't pay for this." The old man smiled. "I already did." For several seconds, Elvis couldn't move. Nobody had shown him such simple kindness in a very long time. He slowly picked up the spoon. The first bite nearly brought tears to his eyes. The stranger watched without saying anything. When Elvis finally finished eating, the old man spoke. "What do you do?" "I sing." "And how did today go?" Elvis laughed bitterly. "They told me to quit." The stranger nodded thoughtfully. "And what do you think?" "I think," Elvis looked toward the rain outside, "maybe they're right." The old man's expression grew serious. "No." One word. Quiet. Certain. "You know the difference between a dream and a destiny?" Elvis frowned. "I don't." "A dream belongs to you." The old man leaned forward. "A destiny belongs to everyone waiting for you, even if they don't know your name yet." Elvis looked confused. "I don't understand." "You will." The stranger reached into his coat and carefully placed an old, rusted key on the table. It was scratched, weathered, unremarkable. Elvis looked at it in confusion. "What's this?" "A promise." "I don't need a key." "No." The old man smiled gently. "You need a reason to keep walking." He slid the key across the table. "There's an abandoned storage building 3 streets from here." Elvis stared at him. "Inside is something I left behind many years ago." "Why are you giving it to me?" "Because I won't be here much longer." The words settled heavily between them. The rain outside seemed louder. "I want you to unlock that door." "And then?" "When you see what's inside, The old man paused. You'll understand why quitting tonight would be the greatest mistake of your life. Elvis picked up the key. It felt unexpectedly heavy. Heavy enough to carry a story. Heavy enough to carry a future. Before he could ask another question, the stranger stood. I have to go. Wait! One day, the old man placed a gentle hand on Elvis's shoulder. When the whole world knows your name, come back here. Elvis nodded. I promise. The stranger smiled. No. His voice became almost emotional. You'll promise after you open the door. Then he walked into the rain. Within seconds, he disappeared into the darkness. Elvis hurried outside. The street was empty. No footsteps, no umbrella, nothing. It was as though the storm itself had swallowed him. Back in the present, Elvis's voice cracked. I never saw him again. Thousands of people remained absolutely still. The old man quietly lowered his eyes. Elvis tightened his grip around the key. I kept my promise. He looked toward the audience. I found the building. A murmur swept through the arena. But when I unlocked that forgotten door, he stopped. Tears filled his eyes once more. I discovered something that changed every moment of the rest of my life. The audience leaned forward as one. No one breathed. No one blinked. Because whatever Elvis had found behind that old door had been powerful enough to shape the destiny of a man the world would one day call the King of Rock and Roll. No one in the theater moved. Thousands of people remained frozen, waiting for the answer that had hidden itself for more than 3 decades. Elvis slowly closed his eyes. I remember every step I took that night. His voice was quiet, so clearly that sometimes I still smell the rain. The arena disappeared from his mind. Once again, he was a frightened young man walking through the empty streets of Memphis with nothing except an old rusted key inside his pocket. The storm had begun to fade. Only a soft drizzle remained. The streets were almost deserted. Every building looked abandoned. Every window was dark. Finally, he reached the address the old stranger had described. It wasn't a house. It wasn't a shop. It was an old brick warehouse standing alone at the end of a narrow alley. Its wooden sign had long since fallen. The windows were covered with dust. The heavy steel door looked as though no one had touched it in years. This can't be the place, Elvis whispered, yet something deep inside him told him to keep walking. He climbed the cracked concrete steps. His hands trembled as he reached into his pocket. The old key felt strangely warm, almost alive. He slid it into the ancient lock. For one long second, nothing happened. Then, click. The lock turned effortlessly. The massive door slowly opened with a long, echoing groan. A cloud of dust drifted into the night air. Moonlight slipped through the doorway. Elvis stepped inside. He expected to find forgotten furniture, old tools, broken boxes. Instead, he found hundreds of wooden shelves stretching across the enormous room. Every shelf was filled with carefully labeled notebooks, thousands of them, each one protected from dust beneath simple cloth covers. In the very center of the warehouse stood an old piano. Its black paint had faded. Several keys were chipped, but it looked loved, not abandoned. A single envelope rested on the piano. Across the front,
Written in careful handwriting were only 4 words. For whoever needs hope. Elvis stared at it. His heart pounded. He slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The first line made him stop breathing. If you are reading this, it means you almost gave up. His hands began to shake. He continued reading. I know, because I once stood exactly where you stand now. People laughed at my dreams. They told me I wasn't talented enough. They told me life had already decided who I would become. They were wrong. Tears blurred Elvis's vision. He turned the page. This warehouse belongs to dreamers who arrive on the worst night of their lives. Every notebook here belongs to someone who refused to surrender. Some became teachers. Some became doctors. Some remained unknown. But every one of them chose hope over fear. Elvis looked around the room. Thousands of notebooks, thousands of lives, thousands of impossible dreams.
At the bottom of the letter was one final sentence. If you still believe your dream matters, write your name. Beside the piano rested an old fountain pen. Elvis picked it up. He opened the final notebook. Its pages were almost empty. Only a handful of names appeared above a blank space waiting for another. He hesitated. Then, he wrote slowly. Elvis Presley. Nothing extraordinary happened. No music, no miracle. Only silence. But something inside him changed forever. For the first time in months, he believed again. The next morning, he walked back into the world. Not because he was certain he would succeed, but because one stranger had believed in him before he could believe in himself. Years passed. One performance became another. One recording became another. The crowds grew larger. The stages became brighter. The records turned to gold. The applause became endless. Yet after every concert, Elvis searched. He returned to Memphis. He visited shelters, old diners, churches, train stations. He hired investigators. He placed advertisements in newspapers. He asked musicians, police officers, taxi drivers. Nobody had ever heard of the old man. Some claimed no such warehouse had existed. Others insisted the building had burned down years before. Eventually, the city demolished the old neighborhood. The warehouse disappeared. Only the key remained, and the promise. Back in the Las Vegas theater, Elvis slowly looked toward the elderly man standing before him. His eyes overflowed with gratitude. I searched for you my entire life. The old man smiled gently. I know. Why didn't you let me find you? The old man took a slow breath. Because you weren't searching for me. Elvis frowned. You were searching for the person you became. Silence settled over the audience. The old man's words echoed through the theater. I only opened a door. He touched Elvis's shoulder. You chose to walk through it. Elvis could no longer hold back his tears. You saved me. The old man slowly shook his head. No. You saved yourself. Another quiet silence followed. Then the old man reached into his pocket once more. This time he removed a folded photograph. The edges had yellowed with age. He handed it to Elvis. It showed the warehouse exactly as it had looked on that rainy night. Standing beside the piano was a much younger version of the old man. Around him stood dozens of ordinary people. Teachers, mechanics, nurses, farmers, musicians, children. None of them looked famous. Every one of them was smiling. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a single sentence. Greatness begins with one person who refuses to let another person give up. Elvis pressed the photograph against his chest. The old man smiled one last time. I didn't come for thanks. I came because my journey is ending. A shadow crossed Elvis's face. What do you mean? The old man looked toward the audience.
I wanted to see what became of the frightened young man who walked into that warehouse. He laughed softly. I think I have my answer.
He extended his hand. Elvis took it. The old man's grip was weak,
but his smile was peaceful. Promise me something. Anything. When you find someone standing where you once stood, be the one who opens the next door.
A tear rolled down Elvis's cheek.
I promise.
The old man nodded, satisfied. He quietly turned and began walking toward the aisle. No security guard stopped him. No fan asked for an autograph. People instinctively stepped aside, as though they all understood they were witnessing something too sacred to interrupt. Halfway to the exit, he paused, looked back one final time, raised his hat, and disappeared through the theater doors. Elvis stood motionless. He wanted to follow, but somehow he knew he wasn't supposed to. Instead, he walked slowly back onto the stage. He picked up his guitar.
The orchestra waited for instructions. He gently shook his head. No orchestra tonight. No arrangements. No rehearsal. No performance. This one comes from the heart. The musicians quietly lowered their instruments. The theater became completely silent. Elvis sat alone beneath a single white spotlight. He closed his eyes. His fingers brushed across the strings. A melody emerged that no one had ever heard before. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. It wasn't written for records or radio. It was a song of gratitude, a song about hope, a song about strangers who change lives without asking for recognition. By the second verse, people in the front rows were crying openly. By the third, the musicians themselves struggled to hold back tears. By the final chorus, the entire theater had become a sea of silent faces, glistening beneath the lights. When the last note faded, no one applauded. Not because they didn't love the song, because applause somehow felt too small.
Elvis slowly looked toward the theater doors where the old man had disappeared. He smiled through his tears. Then he quietly whispered words the microphone barely captured. Every stage gave me an audience, but one stranger gave me a future.
For nearly a full minute, the theater remained silent. No one wanted to be the first to break the moment. Years later, people would argue about which concert had been Elvis's greatest performance. Some would name the biggest crowds, others would remember the most famous songs. But those who were inside that Las Vegas theater told a different story. They said the greatest thing Elvis Presley ever gave an audience was not a hit record, not a legendary performance, not even his voice. It was the reminder that a single act of quiet kindness can change the direction of an entire human life. And sometimes, the most valuable key in the world
never opens a door. It opens a heart.